Okay, hello. We are now at lecture 4 for methodology, findings, and conclusion. The cluster that I'm doing is social science and business management. What will you learn through this set of PowerPoint slides? Number one, you will be given some tips for writing methodology, some general tips. You'll be given, you'll be given, you'll be taught some ways to write the methodology. You'll also be taught how to write the findings and also the conclusion. Okay, writing your methodology. First, I will begin with some tips for writing strong methodology. The first tip is focus on your objectives and research question. Maybe even before writing the methodology, you need to go back to your objectives and your research question, check, okay, check and make sure that the methodology that you have chosen is in line with the objectives and the research question. The methodology section should clearly show why your methods suit your objectives. And you need to convince the reader that you chose the best possible approach to answering your possible statement and research questions. Throughout this section, relate your choices back to the central purpose of your dissertation. Next, remember to always write for an audience. As It's helpful to even think of it's better to write too much than not write enough. So consider how much information you need to give and don't go into unnecessary details. Yes, fine. Although you need to be careful not to go into unnecessary detail, but you have to remember that you need to really explain clearly, maybe give examples, you need to cite, all right? If you're using methods that are standard for your discipline, you probably don't need to give lots of background of justification. But if you take an approach that is less common in your field, you might need to explain and justify your methodological choices. This would be definitely citing from the experts. In either case, your methodology should be a clear, well-structured text that makes an argument for your approach, not just a list of technical details and procedure, right? Next, you definitely need to cite from relevant sources. Your methodology can be strengthened, needs to be strengthened by referencing to existing research in the field. All right? Why? Either to confirm you followed established practices for this type of research. Yes, one reason is the reason why you cite from sources is that you're trying to share with the reader. Look here, I got this idea to do this methodology is because this past researcher did this. Discuss how you evaluated different methodologies and decided on your approach. Show that you took a novel methodological approach to address a gap in the literature. This is definitely true citation in your past research. Um, you can also look at you can go online and go to citation generators that can help you to create MLA or APA citation. Actually, if you go online, you can find a lot of citation generation apps or website. You can straight away type your references as you do your work. Next, evaluate and justify your Next that you need to justify is your instrumentation, whether or not you use instrumentation that has been used, that has been tested, or you come up with your own instrumentation. You need to cite, all right? Mention some types of categories of instrumentation. Explain in detail what is the instrumentation of your study. How did you design it? Where do you get it from? All right? What does it contain? Who does it? What does it measure? What do you want to measure? And don't forget to also discuss issues of reliability and validity in your study pertaining to your instrumentation especially. Let's go on to the next one, next section, what to write in methodology. All right. Now, in this section, I will be sharing with you, number one, how to write methodological approach. Number two, how to write data collection. Number three, how to write data analysis. Let's go to step one, number one, methodological approach. How do you write methodological approach? Okay, you begin by introducing your overall approach to the research. Just do a general overall write-up. What research problem or question did you investigate? And what kind of data do you need to answer? You can choose either quantitative methods, for example, surveys. Okay, they're best for measuring ranking, categorization, categorizing, identifying patterns, and making generalizations. You can also choose qualitative methods, for example, interviews, and they're best for describing, interpreting, contextualizing, and gaining in-depth insight into specific concepts or phenomena. Or some researchers choose mixed methods that allow for a combination of numerical measurement and in-depth exploration. Whatever method you choose, justify it. Depending on your discipline and approach, you might also begin with a discussion of the rationale and assumptions underpinning your methodology. Was your aim to address a practical or a theoretical research problem? Why is this the most suitable approach to answering your research question? Is this a standard methodology in your field? Or does it require justification? Were there any ethical or philosophical considerations? For many postgraduate students, this is the stage where you actually should um, check with your supervisors and make sure that your proposal have gone through the ethical committee in the research department in your university. What are the criteria for validity and reliability in this type of research? So next, step two, you should write how you plan to collect your data or how data was collected. If it's a thesis, if it's a proposal, how you plan to collect the data. What do you write here? Describe your methods of data collection. Once you have introduced your overall methodological approach, you should give full details of the research methods you use. All right. For further clarification, you might read up again for some of the existing research methods. Outline the tools, procedures, and materials you use to gather data and the criteria you use to select participants or sources. Okay, let's look at data collection method. What do you write? Okay, you either choose, if you choose qualitative methods, or if you choose quantitative methods, or you choose qualitative methods. Okay, the next few slides will explain how you can go about writing data collection methods for quantitative and also qualitative methods. Let's look at quantitative method data collection first. You describe your methods of data collection. Um, um, you will describe your methods by, first of all, by explaining what is your method. Okay, for example, the first type is survey. Okay, if you choose survey, you must describe your survey very clearly, where, when, and how the survey was conducted. All right, how did you design the question? Did you take from an existing survey? And what form did it take? Multiple choice, rating, how many Likert scale, and so on and so forth. What sampling method did you use to select participants? Did you conduct surveys by phone, mail, online, or in person? How long did the participants have to respond? Okay, you need to also to explain what was the sample size and the response rate. You might also want to include the full questionnaire as an appendix so that your reader can see exactly what data was collected. So the first type for quantitative method collection is surveys. Let's look at the second type of quantitative data method collection, data collection, experiments. All right, you need to give the full details of the tools that you use, the techniques, the procedures. All right, how did you design the experiment? How did you recruit participants? How did you manipulate and measure the variables? What tools or technologies did you use in the experiment? In experimental research, it is especially important to give enough detail for another researcher to reproduce your result. All right. Next type, the third type is existing data. You can also use existing data for your quantitative method. Just explain how you gathered and selected the material. It can also be from publication, uh, from archival data, all right? Uh, where did you source the material from? How was the data originally produced? What criteria did you use to select the material? Okay, the data range from when to when, from where to where. Okay, so you need to you need to explain clearly. Okay, before we go on to qualitative, let me give you one example of quantitative methods example. One example here, the survey consisted of 5 Likert scale multiple choice questions and 10 questions that the respondents had to answer with a 7-point Likert scale. The aim was to conduct the survey with 350 customers of company X on the company premises in The Hague from when 4th to 8 July when 2014 between when 11 from 11 a.m. and 11 a.m. and 1500 hours. A customer was defined as a person who had purchased a product from company X on the day of questioning. Participants were given 5 minutes to fill the survey anonymously, and 408 customers responded. Because not all surveys are fully completed, 371 survey results were included in the analysis. So this is an example of how you write how data was collected through quantitative method sample. Okay, let's go on to qualitative qualitative method data collection. Again, the first type is interview and focus group. This is a popular one. Describe where, when, and how the interviews were conducted. It's got to be specific. How did you find and select the participants? How many people took part? What form did the interviews take? Were they structured? Were they semi-structured? Were they unstructured? How long were the interviews and how were they recorded? Type 2, you can also use participant observation for your qualitative method. Describe where, when, and how you conducted the observation. What group or community did you observe and how did you gain access to them? How long did you spend conducting the research and where was it located? How did you record your data? It is audiovisual recordings and note taking. Here you might also want to put in the appendix approval letters that you've gotten prior to going for either the interview or the observation. Next, type 3, you can also use existing data. All right. Um, Explain how you selected case study materials such as text or images, or for the focus of your analysis, what type of materials did you utilize? You can use online materials, blog discussion, all these are existing data. How did you collect and how did you select them? You might also want to explain the range. Let's look at one qualitative method example. In order to gain a better insight into the possibilities for improved of the product range, semi-structured interviews were conducted with 8 returning customers from the main target group of Company X. A returning customer was defined as someone who usually bought products at least twice a week from Company X. The surveys were used to select participants who belong to the target group. Interviews were conducted in a small office next to the cash register, exactly where, and lasted approximately exactly how long? 20 minutes each. Answers were recorded by note taking, and 7 interviews were also filmed. How? With consent. One interviewee preferred not to be filmed. So very detailed. Okay, let's move on to data analysis. Okay, let's look at how you want to explain how you did your data analysis. Let's look at quantitative. Okay, you should indicate how you process and analyze the data. Avoid going into too much detail. You should not start presenting or discussing any. Don't be very careful here. I've had a student who got carried away and ended up even presenting the result at this stage. No, no, this is where you explain how you analyze it. You do not explain the findings. You don't explain the data that you found. You do not discuss the data here. It's how you analyze, how you do it, how an analysis was done. Okay, so for quantitative methods, in quantitative research, your analysis will be based on numbers. So in the method section, you might want to include things like, have you prepared your data before analyzing it? Checking for missing data, removing outliers, transforming variables. Explain that. All right. Which software did you use? All right. Now, if it's SPSS, you might want to say which version. Which statistical method you use, two-tailed, t-test, simple linear, explain. All right. Let's look at one example. For quantitative, before analysis, the gathered data was prepared. You explain, this one you explain how you analyzed it. The data set was checked for missing data and outliers. For this, the outlier labeling rule was used. All values outside the calculated range were considered outliers. Then you cite. The data was then analyzed using statistical software SPSS. So this is how you write, how you analyze data for quantitative method. Next, qualitative data analysis. In qualitative research, your analysis will be based on language, images, and probably even observations. Often it involves some form of textual analysis. Specific methods can include, number one, content analysis. What is it? It is the categorizing and discussing the meaning of words, phrases, and sentences. All right. It can also it will include thematic analysis. You have a certain code that you follow from your instrument, and you code and you closely examine the data to identify broad themes and patterns. Also, it can be discourse analysis, studying communication and meaning in relation to their social context. It can be any of this. You analyze in any of these ways. An example, the interviews were transcribed and thematic analysis was conducted. This involved coding all the data before identifying and reviewing 6 key themes. Each theme was examined to gain an understanding of participants' perceptions and motivation. Okay, so this is one way of writing the how you analyze qualitative data. All right. Okay, we have come to the end of how to write methodology. The next section will discuss how to write your findings. Maybe if you might want to pause the session here and take maybe a 5 or 10 minutes break before you go on to the next section. Okay, next section will be writing your findings. There are many ways of writing the findings. What I will give you is not the only way. You can choose many ways as long as it's clear and clearly shows that you have answered your research question. The opening paragraph of a finding section often restates research questions. You might want to remind the reader what your research questions were. They might not have remembered, especially if your thesis is very thick. They would have to go back. So why not you remind them, help them to remember, or aims to refocus the reader's attention. And it is always wise to summarize key findings at the end of the section, providing a smooth intellectual transition to the interpretation and discussion that follows in most research papers. All right, you might want to focus on the research question, but after every section, maybe remind the reader that, okay, this section you have already answered the first research question, and so on and so forth. There are many effective ways in which to organize research findings. The structure of your findings section might be determined. It might be determined by your research questions and hypotheses, or match the arrangement of your method section. Uh, Make your choice, decide, and be consistent. Report the relevant findings for each of the research question or hypotheses with a focus on how you analyzed them. All right. Let's consider my title as an example. Remember this title? Relationship between perceived writing difficulties, writing behavior, and writing performance among undergraduates in University X towards academic writing. Following the title tips, I've got the variable setting and the subject. All right. So from there, I have the research questions. All right. I have research question on perceived writing difficulty. How has perceived writing difficulty influenced academic writing of undergraduates in University X? How has writing behavior influenced perceived writing difficulties? And is there any significant difference in the mean scores of writing performance across faculties at University X? All right, so these are some examples. All right, so you have there three research questions. Try not to have the exact, yes, although the findings need to be um, grouped according to research question. All right. You could have an introduction for 4.1 and then 4.2 immediately try to answer the first research question. However, you try not to have the exact research questions wording for subheadings. All right. Although it's not wrong. I've seen people doing it, but try not to do it. Try to be creative. Try to convert the whole research question back to keywords. So your heading is not the research question, your heading will be the keywords. Okay? For example, if how does writing perceive writing difficulty, if your research question has the word perceive writing difficulty, so instead of having the heading for that section 4.2 or 4.2 as how the whole of the research question, how has, just write research writing difficulty. Then the whole under beneath it will be your data analysis findings for the data. Okay, so this is the format for the findings write up. You have an introduction. Again, write the introduction last. You finish writing up your findings, and then you go back, and when you're done, and then you write your introduction so that when the reader reads the first part, the reader knows what to expect in your findings. All right. Some suggestion 4.1 could be the introduction, just maybe one paragraph. And then 4.2, you could write the findings for demographic profile. All right. Some writers might want to report this section using percentages or even maybe pie charts or even just for tables, but this could be just percentages. All right. This is for the demographic profile of your samples. All right. And 4.3 is the findings for the first keyword, like just now. Instead of having the whole how has perceived writing difficulty, you can have just the word perceived writing difficulty. So it's a heading. All right. It's not a sentence or it's not a question. 4.3. So present here in the form of a table. You can also present in the form of charts or even excerpts from qualitative data. All right. So if it's quantitative, you might want to present your table, you want to present your charts. For qualitative data here, you might want to present the the excerpts from the data and the explanation. All right. Whatever it is, remember that the diagrams do not speak for themselves. The immediately after or before a diagram, elaborate what the diagram is all about. All right, then you go on to explain the next findings. Each time, the format is the data and your explanation. The data and your explanation. All right, you can leave the explanation the way it is. Just report what the findings are. Perhaps even at the chapter 4 findings, you need not relate to past research yet, because there will be lots of data that you'll be reporting here. All right. And finally, you might want to just wrap up these findings. All right. Now, for thesis like masters or even PhD, more often than not, your findings is not just chapter 4. All right. So the reason why I'm giving you a very brief explanation of how to write findings is because there are many ways of doing it. All right. Another way will be, when I was doing my PhD, my findings is not only one chapter. I have like 4 chapters of findings. So I have chapter 1, introduction, which everybody will have. Chapter 2 is the methodology. Chapter 2 is the literature review. Chapter 3 is the methodology. Then chapter 4, 5, 6, 7 is actually my findings. And my findings for each of the research question, data, I have such a rich data for each of the research question. Therefore, I actually break them all my research question into chapters, separate chapters, and they become separate findings for separate chapter findings. So it all depends on the richness of your data for you to decide whether your findings is only just chapter 4 or it extends further on. All right, next one, conclusion. All right. So this is the final chapter of your thesis. Okay. So um, general overview. Again, this is not the only way, but this is the way that this is my favorite way of doing it. All right. So I have 5.1 summary of findings. Now, for 5.1, for the summary of findings, I go back to my to my findings, my chapter 4, or all the chapters of my uh, findings reporting. It could be just one chapter or more. I go back to all the findings and I categorize the summary. So at least, because your reader have finished reading such an elaborate finding in chapter 4. And for some of you, your chapter 4 for your findings is not only one chapter. They saw so many numbers, they saw so many data. They do not remember. Although every section of your findings, you show them that you have answered the research question. But again, the richness of the data might might get lost, all right, in the chapter of findings. So here you might spend a few paragraphs maybe summarizing the findings in general. Actually here you are even making the reader remember, trying to recap the all the general findings of your research. All right, it will be very helpful, and this can just be num just numbers or data, or just explaining just a summary. Out of all this is what you found out for your first research question. This is what you found out, and you can maybe even explain what was the highest, the pattern, what was the lowest. You can here you can explain your pattern also here in your summary of findings. All right. Then when you reach the discussion 5.2, this is when, for each of the summarized data, you might want to make connections to past studies. Some people choose some people choose to join discussion and summary, is up to you. But what exactly does this discussion entails? This is when you go back to your past study, especially not much of the theories part. Remember your literature review? There's this theory part and the past study. This is when you go back to your past study and you check to see whether your findings is in line with the research done by other people or it is against. You will cite here. All right, okay. um and if it's in line, good, you explain this is what they found out, this is what you found out. Now if it is the opposite, fine, it's also okay. Maybe you have to justify why do you think your data is actually the opposite of the findings in the research done by so and so. This is when your thinking, critical thinking skills come in. You need to analyze why certain things happen the way they did. Okay. Some prefer to answer this according to the research questions. It's up to you. All right. I actually base this discussion on the headings of my keywords actually. So it becomes clear and I can see an organization in my discussion. All right. Next one is the implications of the study. All right. Or some even call it pedagogical implications if it's a teaching and learning research. So either one. Okay, this is the stage where now that you found out this in your research, this was what you found out in your data. So what? So, if it's about workplace, so this is what you found out. So what kind of changes should that be at the workplace from what you found out? If it's pedagogical implication, this is what you found out in your findings. So how can teaching and learning change after this? So this is the so what section. So what? So what? So where do I go from here? Okay, and the second last section will be suggestions for future research. You should this is the section, remember, this is not the section for you to say why you are not able, um, your weaknesses. You don't have to explain why you're not able to do certain things and leave it as that. You can explain your limitations. All right. But whatever your problems and your limitations should come with solutions. All right. So this is the part where you suggest what future researchers can do for your area of research. All right. And for future researchers, when they read this research of yours, they actually can use this as to begin their research gap. This is what you have found out. This is what the previous researchers have found out. And this is where they will pick up. So this is the section where you will suggest future research in your area. All right. And finally, the summary, the conclusion of what the whole of the chapter 5 was about. All right. Okay, before we end, let's summarize this set of PowerPoint slides. I have come to the end of this set of PowerPoint slides for chapter 3, chapter 4, and chapter 5. Thank you very much for listening.